In the Sumerian city of Ur, around 2600 BC, a funeral of a queen is taking place. The deceased Queen Puabi has finally been laid to rest in her lavish tomb. But this is different. She is not alone. In what has been dubbed the Great Death Pit, dozens of her servants and court ladies lie arranged in orderly fashion, adorned with fine jewelry and holding cups. They were sacrificed, given poison to drink, accompanying their queen into the mysteries of the next world. It's a chilling image, an entire retinue entering death together. Why would a society do this? The answer can only be that they believed that their queen would live on in some fashion after death, and therefore needed her servants to attend her. Here, at the very start of the Bronze Age, we have our powerful evidence that people took the concept of an afterlife very seriously. So seriously that they staged a grand, albeit gruesome, send-off. We're going to step back today, almost 4,000 to 5,000 years, into the Bronze Age, exploring a question that has fascinated humans for as long as we've been aware of our own mortality. It's a simple question, but it's as equally fascinating as it is frightening. What happens after death? This isn't a talk examining philosophy or talking about theology in modern senses. We're just looking at the concrete beliefs that were recorded by Bronze Age civilizations themselves, and we're not going to judge them. We're just going to talk about them. Now, we'll hear directly from the ancient texts, which we have many preserved on those clay tablets, the voices of long-dead kings, priests, and scribes, describing their hopes and fears about the world beyond the grave. Today, we're going to be doing most Bronze Age civilizations, except for China and the Indus Valley, which I want to discuss in a separate video. This talk will be structured as if you're attending a tour throughout several of these cultures: Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Hittites being in Anatolia, the Levant, the Canaanites, and even the Aegean, Bronze Age Greece. And we'll see if we can piece together what they really believed about the afterlife. We'll rely on primary sources, tomb inscriptions, epic poems, and mythological records, intending to let the ancient voices speak for themselves. I'll do my best to provide context so it all makes sense. But the goal is to hear these beliefs as they were understood at the time, without imposing our modern morality and interpretations upon them. By the end, I hope that you'll appreciate both the diversity and the common threads in Bronze Age afterlife beliefs. But before we dive in, let's have a quick note on chronology. When we say the Bronze Age, it spans many centuries and cultures. A timeline can be roughly given around 3300 to 1200 BC or BCE for those inclined to use the different dating conventions. Beliefs did evolve over time, within a single civilization, of course. But our approach will be thematic and cultural rather than chronological. Also, I'd like you to keep in mind that much of the evidence is religious or royal. The beliefs of everyday farmers and laborers, the proletariat, if you're going to call them that, are a little bit harder to glimpse at, except where, of course, burial customs speak for themselves. Now, with all that said, I hope that your imaginations are ready and your minds are open. We can journey into the past and see what the Bronze Age people thought waited them beyond the grave. Before we do, I invite you to like and subscribe, share the video, and check out the Patreon or merchandise store if you are inclined to do so. Let's get nice and relaxed, and we can begin. So beginning this talk, why not begin where a lot of the interest lies? Take a walk through the field of reeds and we'll begin with the Egyptian afterlife. When it comes to the afterlife beliefs, ancient Egypt itself offers one of the most elaborate and also optimistic visions. You'll see that the word optimistic will be, well, perhaps not repeated in the later beliefs. The Egyptians practically obsessed over life and death. It was a big deal. They built massive tombs, perfected mummification to preserve the body, and composed extensive texts to guide the soul in the hereafter. It was a very complicated process. It was all written down, all ritualized, and they were experts. Their belief system was remarkably detailed, and it remained influential for thousands of years. So we better talk about it, don't you think? One of the first things to understand is that Egyptians envisioned the afterlife as a continuation of the best aspects of life on Earth, but all of those aspects somewhat perfected. They called idyllic hereafter the field of reeds, Seket Aru, essentially a paradise that looked like the Nile Delta in full bloom, a perfect blue sky, not too hot, not too cold, everything in its place. It sounds nice, doesn't it? Kinda the place that you'd want to go. If you were scared of where the next place would be, you'd want to imagine somewhere nice like that. In fact, we have a New Kingdom tomb inscription that sums it up pretty well in beautiful detail around 1400 BC. And it goes like this. May I walk every day unceasing on the banks of my water. May my soul rest on the branches of trees which I have planted. May I refresh myself in the shadow of my sycamore. In these words, an Egyptian elite, an upperclassman, expresses the heartfelt wish to spend eternity strolling by his own beloved gardens and orchards, enjoying shade and clear water. No sickness, no aging, no death, none of that. Just an eternal, idealized Egypt, his homeland, forever. And this was the reward for a life well lived and a successful navigation of the trials of death. Of course, it all sounds good, but I'm afraid there's a price. One did not automatically gain entry into this paradise. Tickets were limited. The Egyptians developed a complex theology of judgment. By the time the New Kingdom, that is around 1500 BC, the dominant belief was that upon death, a person's soul, specifically their heart, which embodied the conscience, would be weighed on scales against the feather of Ma'at, the divine symbol of truth and justice. In fact, you might have seen some of the depictions in funerary papyri, like the papyrus of Hunefer. If your heart was free from the heavy weight of wrongdoing, in other words, it balanced with the feather, you were declared true of voice, ma keru. Essentially, you were vindicated, and congratulations, you were allowed to enter the eternal bliss of the afterlife. But if not, the consequences were not very good. A fearsome demoness named Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, the three most fearsome animals, well, perhaps if we're discounting the snakes, would gobble up your heart, consigning you to the second death, non-existence. The prospect of annihilation was the ultimate punishment for the unjust, thrown into the void, the dustbin of life. To avoid this fate, Egyptians had to arm themselves with spells and declarations of innocence. In the famous spell number 125 of the Book of the Dead, which is also, by the way, called the Book of Going Forth by Day. Now, the Book of the Dead's a little bit more of a marketable name, I suppose. the deceased makes a negative confession, denying a list of sins before the tribunal of Osiris. For example, one would say something like, I have not stolen, I have not committed murder, I have not told lies, and so on. A remark will look into the moral code. If judges accepted these statements and the heart test was passed, the deceased could proceed. But for Egyptians, death was not really an ending, but more of a transition, often called the westering, since bodies were buried on the west bank of the Nile where the sun set. They believed a person was composed of multiple spiritual parts, as being Ka, Ba, etc., that had to be reunified after death to form the affective spirit, the Ak. Now, I mentioned that word, the Ka. The Ka was like a vital essence that still needed nourishment, and that's why we see the food offerings in tombs and not just for decorations, and the Ba, which was often depicted as a human-headed bird, represented the individual's mobility to travel between worlds. Each day after death, the Ba soul could leave the tomb and journey with the sun god Ra across the sky, reuniting with the mummified body at night. And of course, then we come to the mummification itself. Well, that was central. You can't go past Egypt without talking about that. Preserving the body intact was important because the soul needed a second home, and had to be a nice one. As a result, Egyptians developed sophisticated embalming to prevent decay, expecting the person would use their physical form again in the next life. Tomb walls were inscribed with spells, like the earlier pyramid texts and coffin texts, the precursors to the Book of the Dead, to guide the deceased post various hazards in the afterworld, which was called the Duat. These texts can also be very dramatic, and I'll read one example. For instance, a pyramid text, the Utterance 213, from the Pyramid of Unas in the 5th dynasty, proclaims to the deceased king as follows: O Unas, you have not gone dead. You have gone alive to sit on the throne of Osiris. Your scepter is in your hand, that you may give orders to the living. Give orders to those of the mysterious sights, the dead. Now here the belief is pretty explicit, don't you think? King Unas lives on after his physical death, assuming a divine throne, alongside Osiris, and even wielding authority over other beings in the netherworld. He just continues to be the king forever. In fact, Egyptian royalty often identified with Osiris, the god who himself died and was resurrected. According to myth, Osiris was a king who was murdered by his evil brother Set, only to be magically reassembled and revived by his wife, and sister, by the way, Isis. Osiris became the lord of the underworld and the judge of the dead, representing the promise of new life, just as crop grows from buried seed. In fact, every deceased Egyptian was somehow likened to Osiris. Funerary texts address the dead as the Osiris, then the name. If proper rituals were done, they hoped to join Osiris's kingdom and partake in his eternal party. Sounds nice. A successful Egyptian afterlife thus had two key requirements: moral righteousness, that is, proving that one's heart is pure and upright, and proper funerary rituals to reconstitute and protect the soul. To achieve this, the living invested enormous effort. I'm sure you've seen it before. What do you think they built all that for? It wasn't for fun. Tombs were built as eternal houses, filled with goods, foods, and even texts and games. Tutankhamun, for example, was buried with clothing, chariots, weapons, and even his favorite board game of Senet, presumably to keep him entertained in eternity. I just hope he doesn't get bored of that game. Tomb inscriptions sometimes even carry curses to ward off robbers, threatening that if you disturb the one that lies within, then you'll incur the wrath of the gods, and you'll be denied your own afterlife. All this shows how real and immediate these beliefs were to the ancient Egyptians. And of course, I suppose we have the question, for those grave robbers, how many of them were really scared off by the warnings? I suppose we'll never know. But we do know that the Tutankhamun tomb was discovered completely intact by Howard Carter back in those days. I think it was 1911, something like that. Well, in summary, an Egyptian back in the Bronze Age believed that if they lived in accordance with Ma'at, this divine order, received proper burial rites and passed the judgment of Osiris, then they would wake to a transformed existence in the field of reeds, and for the rest of their days, farming, feasting, and sailing pleasantly under eternally blue skies. And of course, you'd be able to reunite with your long-lost loved ones. If you were lucky too, I suppose, you could mingle with the gods. There is one text too that cheerfully puts it. One lives eternally in the sun's presence, doing all that one had done on earth and more. It was in many ways an ethically conditioned afterlife, a reward for the virtuous. Stands in contrast to some other Bronze Age cultures, as we'll see shortly, which are interesting in their own right. So before moving on, do you have any questions about Egyptian conception? All right, keep the Egyptian vision in mind. Lush, hopeful, moral. We now shift our tone to a different picture. That of Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. We're going down a deeper rabbit hole now. Mesopotamia, the land of no return, and the underworld of gloom. And so we depart from the sunny optimism of Egypt, arriving in Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia and Assyria, where the afterlife is viewed with less enthusiasm. You see, the people of Mesopotamia, unlike the Egyptians, did not usually long for death or see it as a getaway, a blissful paradise. Instead, their earliest writings speak of a bleak and inert existence after death, a place sometimes called Irkala, or in our tongue, the land of no return. One of our richest sources on Mesopotamian afterlife belief is the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's a great heroic poem from around 2000 BC, and it even has roots with older Sumerian tales, so who knows how far it goes back. If you're not familiar with it, well, basically, the hero king Gilgamesh seeks to overcome death after his friend Enkidu passes away. But before that famous quest, we get a harrowing description of the underworld through a dream that Enkidu has. As Enkidu lies dying, he has a vision of what awaits him below. Now, quote directly from the epic. There is the house whose people sit in darkness. Dust is their food, clay their meat. They are clothed like birds with wings for covering. They see no light, sit in darkness. I entered the house of dust, and I saw the kings of the earth, their crowns put away forever, rulers and princes, all those who once wore kingly crowns and ruled the world in the days of old. They, who had stood in the place of gods, now stand like servants, fetching baked meats in the house of dust, carrying water in the midst of darkness. Now this passage conveys the Mesopotamian house of dust, a dreary underground cavern where all souls, small and great, are forced to endure an eternity of monotony. The imagery is pretty striking. These once proud kings are now just shuffling about in the dark pathetically, dressed in feathers like scrawny birds, eating dirt off the ground for food. There's no differentiation or joy. Everyone is equally miserable. Dust is their food. In other words, the dead survive on the essence of decay itself. Enkidu even mentions meeting Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, and the scribe goddess who keeps the book of the dead. The mere sight of Enkidu, a living man in this vision, causes alarm, for the underworld is strictly not for the living. Mesopotamians refer to this realm by names like Aralu or Kur-nu-ge, a Sumerian word for the land of no return. Unlike the Egyptian field of reeds, there was simply no escape from the Mesopotamian underworld, except in extremely rare, myth-like circumstances, and certainly no shining paradise. But why would they make it like this? Why so grim? Well, one factor is the view of their gods. The Mesopotamia deities did not promise humans a happy afterlife. The best one could hope for was a sort of continuation of existence as a dim ghost, or etemu as they called it, and to at least be remembered by the living. Because, importantly, the dead were thought to retain some needs and influence. They weren't enjoying themselves, but they could often suffer more if neglected. Families were expected to make regular offerings, pour libations of water, leave bread or incense at the graves of their ancestors. If a dead person was not properly buried, or didn't receive these offerings, their spirit might become restless or angry. And if the spirit was angry, it could afflict the living with illness. So even though the underworld was unpleasant, proper burial rites and memorials were important. For example, there is one Sumerian poem where a spirit of a man returns to beg his son for a decent burial, lamenting that without one he's stuck eating scraps in the netherworld. And in Assyrio-Babylonian letters, we also find mention of the rite of Kispu, feeding and provisioning the deceased relatives so that they can stay at peace. It shows a belief that while the underworld was a very grim place, the living could kind of soften the blow of the dead's condition somewhat through offerings. Mesopotamian mythology personified death in the form of the goddess Ereshkigal. She was called the Queen of the Great Below, and her husband Nergal, or Ninurta in earlier versions. One famous myth, the descent of Inanna, or Ishtar as she is also called, recounts how the proud goddess Ishtar, or Inanna, travels to the underworld. She must pass through 7 gates, removing a piece of clothing at each, symbolizing shedding earthly attachments, until she stands completely naked before the Queen Ereshkigal. She is then struck dead and hung on a hook, a vivid metaphor for the fate of anyone entering that realm, even a deity. But later the gods arrange her revival, a rare exception, showing that resurrection was considered a divine miracle and not the norm. An interesting scene from that myth shows the fear of the dead rising too. When Ishtar threatens the gatekeeper to let her in, she says, "If you do not open the gate for me to come in, I will smash the door and shatter the bolt. I will break down the doorpost. I will raise up the dead, eating the living, and the dead will outnumber the living." This dramatic threat is pretty serious, isn't it? To unleash the dead upon the living. It shows the proper order it is for the dead to stay in their realm A breach of that barrier would certainly be catastrophic. The living feared wandering ghosts too, which they called Giddim in Sumerian or Etemu in Akkadian, and they took as many measures to prevent it as they could. Now the myth we just discussed shows that even gods had to respect the inviolate separation of life and death. But what did an ordinary Mesopotamian expect after death? Well, in essence, it was a shadowy existence below, eternal, unless interfered with, lacking joy, but somewhat bearable, if your descendants kept remembering you with offerings. There was no final judgment or moral reckoning like in Egypt. The fate of the afterlife was democratized. Everybody went to the same dreary place. Though perhaps there were slight status distinctions. Some texts suggest that those who died violently or without proper burial suffered more. Notably, there's an old Babylonian poem called The Death of Bilgamesh, which is just another word for Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh asks the ghost of a friend about the fate of various categories of people. The one who died with many sons, who will get many offerings, fares better than the one who died without. This reinforces the idea again. Having a family to perform those funerary rites could make your afterlife more tolerable. And we must use words like tolerable, because tolerance is all you can really hope for. As for Mesopotamian tombs, they included everyday items, pots, weapons, jewelry, quite similar to Egyptian tombs, but likely intended more as immediate grave goods rather than supplies for an eternal paradise. The grand royal tombs of Ur, as we saw, even included human sacrifices. Interestingly, Mesopotamian kings did not claim they'd ascend to join the gods. Even the king expected to join his ancestors in the underworld. There is an Akkadian phrase, eternal life, but it usually meant lasting fame on earth. They didn't really mean a literal immortality, no matter how many people are arguing for it. And the Epic of Gilgamesh drives that home too. Another quote is, "When the gods created man, they set death as his destiny." However, there were a few nuances and evolving ideas. In later periods, by the late Bronze and certainly the Iron Age, so after 1200, we see Mesopotamian text hinting at the possibility of a better fate for a few special individuals. We're talking heroes or those who are divinized after death. The legendary figure Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, like the Mesopotamian version of Noah, basically. Well, he was granted immortality by the gods and lives at the mouth of the rivers in a faraway place. But he's a very rare exception. 1 in a million. For the vast majority, the hope was not for heaven, but just for a restful oblivion. A nice little corner in the dusty abyss. So to conclude the Mesopotamian section, they believed in afterlife, but it was not one to look forward to. It was inevitable and part of the cosmic order of things, hence the focus on living a good life and having children to honor you, rather than on preparing one's soul for paradise. It's a pretty melancholic view, and it would persist in the region for centuries. Echoes of it appear in the Hebrew Bible's concept of Sheol, a pit where the dead souls languish, very much resembling the Mesopotamian underworld, just changing it up a little bit. So before moving on, once again we highlight that quick contrast. In Mesopotamia, even kings and heroes served in the afterlife. I want you to recall the line, "They who once ruled the world now carry water and baked meats in the house of dust." This resignation, death as the great equalizer, is practically the opposite of Egypt's vibrant continuation of status and joy. And keep that in mind as we travel a little bit northwest to Anatolia, the home of the Hittites, and we'll see yet another perspective. So, we now visit the Hittite civilization of Anatolia. That's in today's Turkey, which thrived in the late Bronze Age. We're talking 1700 to 1200. The Hittite belief system is interesting because it seems to be a melting pot of indigenous Hattian, Hurrian, and Indo-European elements. Their afterlife beliefs are admittedly less richly documented than Egypt or Mesopotamia, but we do have clues from royal rituals, art, and mythology. One standout feature of the Hittite royal ideology is the idea that the king, and perhaps the queen, became a god upon death. In fact, Hittite texts routinely refer to the deceased kings with the phrase, "he became a god at death." While alive, the Hittite king was appointed servant of the gods, not considered divine himself, unlike Egyptian pharaohs who were kind of like demigods, semi-divine figures on earth, but in death he joined the ranks. A modern study summarizes, Hittite kings lived as mortals and became deified. This implies that they believed in some kind of exalted afterlife, at least for royalty. The king's spirit would dwell among the gods, honored with cult and offerings. Indeed, after a king died, his successors would perform funerary rites and likely offer sacrifices to the departed king's spirit as one of the gods. How exactly did the Hittites imagine this divine afterlife for their rulers? We have a hint in the burial practices. Uniquely, Hittite royals might be cremated, unlike Egyptians who were mummified. Of course, the idea of cremating someone to an ancient Egyptian, that is an absolutely horrifying idea. But for the Hittites, that was just normal. One textual account, reconstructed from fragmentary instructions, describes the funerary ritual for a great king. His body was burned on a pyre for several days, with offerings and prayers made, and after the flames died, the remaining bones were collected, wrapped up, and buried. During these rites, the court would speak to the king's spirit, bidding them farewell and presumably acknowledging his new divine status. One line goes, it's paraphrased, "O king, you have become a god, and are going to the gods." The whole emphasis was on release, the soul leaving the earth to join the celestial or chthonic deities. Now, the Hittites worshipped a plethora of gods, we know that. The text often invoked the 1,000 gods of Hatti, so we know there's at least 1,000 of them. Among these were deities of the underworld, notably the sun goddess of the earth, a female solar deity who was believed to rule the underground, separate from the sun of heaven, and a god called Lelwani, originally male, later seen as female, a deity of the underworld. They also venerated ancestor deities to some extent. It seems that the spirits of important people could be revered as a sort of minor deity after death. For example, deceased kings might have had statues or stelae where offerings were made in their memory, effectively treating them as protective ancestral spirits. As far as Hittite mythology, we unfortunately don't have an epic description of the afterlife like we do in Gilgamesh, but we do have iconography. A prime example is the rock-cut sanctuary at Yazlikaya, near the Hittite capital of Hattusa. In Chamber B of this sanctuary, there's a famous relief carving of the 12 gods of the underworld, a file of 12 identical figures wearing tall pointed hats and short tunics, marching together in procession. The presence of these gods of the underworld shows that the Hittites had a concept of a subterranean realm governed by deities, much like Mesopotamia's Ereshkigal or the later Hades of Greek tradition. The dead presumably went on to this realm. There isn't evidence that the average person expected a joyous afterlife. Likely the common Hittite view was somewhat closer to Mesopotamia's in that the dead became weak shades dwelling in that mysterious dusty land of darkness. In one Hittite prayer, a queen laments her dying husband and hopes the sun goddess of earth will take him to herself and free him from pain. This suggests a belief in being gathered to the goddess's care, of course. But what about the man on the street? Ordinary people. Archaeologically, both inhumation and cremation were practiced by the Hittites, and neighboring peoples too, like the Luwians. They often buried ashes or bodies along with goods, sometimes terracotta figures. It's possible that they believed in some form of the spirit surviving. But interestingly, Hittite texts also mention something somewhat grim. If certain taboos were broken, these gods of the underworld might punish the living with misfortune, plague, or anything else they could come up with. This indicates that the dead and the underworld gods could influence the living, an incentive to perform proper funerary rituals and respect ancestors. So in summary, I suppose Hittite afterlife beliefs straddle a line. On one hand, they had no elaborate paradise like Egypt, and likely shared the broader Near Eastern view of a gloomy underworld for most. But on the other hand, their kings expected apotheosis, that is, becoming gods, and religious emphasis was placed on ensuring that the dead were cared for, so that they wouldn't disturb the living. Proper ritual had to be kept. The Hittite civilization fell around 1200 BC with the Bronze Age collapse, leaving us with many uncertain details. But later Anatolian cultures, like the Phrygians and Lydians, would continue some of these ideas of hero cults and honoring tombs. I suppose we'll have to wait until we dig something else out of the ground. Let's just hope that we can find some Hittite version of the Epic of Gilgamesh or something like that. I won't hold my breath. But if I wake up one morning to a news story saying that they've found something, guess who's making a new video on the Hittites? So, moving on from Anatolia, let's go a little bit south, and we'll find ourselves firmly within the Levant, among the Canaanite people. And like everyone else, they had their own intriguing take on death's domain. Shades of Canaan and the Feast of Rephaim. In the Bronze Age Levant, we're talking regions including modern Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, people such as the Canaanites also believed in an underworld and a continuing existence of the dead. Thanks to texts from the city-state Ugarit around 1300 BC, we have a pretty good insight into West Semitic beliefs. Ugarit in modern Syria left behind clay tablets with myths and rituals in a Canaanite tongue, shedding light on how these people conceptualized life after death. The general Canaanite term for the realm of the dead was similar to others. In later Hebrew, it's Sheol, and Ugaritic might have had Apuku or Arsi, terms for the underworld. It was seen as a shadowy place below, ruled by the god Mot, that is, the word for death. Mot is featured in the Ugaritic Baal cycle as an insatiable power who even drags the mighty storm god Baal into his maw, causing the land's fertility to cease until Baal is rescued. When describing Baal's demise, The texts have Mot say that he churned Baal in his jaws like a piece of olive paste, graphic imagery of death as a devourer. So clearly, the underworld was not thought of as a very pleasant place to be, rather as a insatiable, hungry abyss. More enlightening are the Ugaritic ritual texts that show how ancestors, particularly the dead kings, were venerated. In one text, sometimes called the Rephaim text, we see the king performing rites for the illustrious dead. The word Rephaim is used for these departed heroes or kings gone. A portion of the funerary liturgy for the recently deceased King Nikmadu III of Ugarit goes like this, in an admittedly summarized translation. The priest invokes the assembly of the mighty dead, Rapa Umma, calling on the ancient kings by name to attend. There is then a call for mourning. Even the king's throne and footstool are said to weep symbolically. The sun goddess Shapash, who in Canaanite belief has the role of traversing the underworld at night, is invoked to guide the king's soul. According to analysis, this text invokes the Rapiumma, the noble dead, with two former kings mentioned by name, and it calls for the mourning of the king's throne, and invokes the sun god Shapshu. The deceased king is then escorted to the underworld by these earlier kings, the Rephaim. We see here a belief that when a new king dies, the spirits of previous kings rise, figuratively, of course, to greet him and guide him to join their fellowship. It's almost like a formal induction, a handshake meeting, welcome to the group in an ancestral hall of fame down there in the underworld. But what's particularly interesting is that the Rephaim are described in Ugarit and later traditions as demigod-like or even heroic dead who still have power. Ugaritic incantations portray them riding chariots or attending feasts in the underworld. One Ugaritic invocation meal calls the Rephaim to drink wine with the living king, indicating a ritual communication and unity between the living and dead royals. So really, for the Canaanites, the afterlife was not just gloom, it wasn't that bad. It also had the aspect of joining one's ancestors in a sort of continual community. The average person likely became a weak shade. Well, this is mut in Ugarit, akin to the Hebrew met, meaning dead one. But the honored dead, and especially the kings, could be venerated. Perhaps similar how in Catholic tradition saints are dead humans basically revered and entreated, raised to godlike status almost. At Ugarit, the dead kings were even called Ilnim, gods in some contexts, implying a form of ancestor deification. However, there was no promise of bliss or reward for good behavior, at least none that we know of. Mortality, or morality rather, in life wasn't explicitly tied to afterlife outcome in the text that we have. Instead, status and proper rites, they were the most important. Dying without proper burial or without any descendants to perform the proper rites was a feared misfortune, just like in Mesopotamia. Curses on tombs from this region and later Phoenician inscriptions threaten anybody who disturbs the grave by being cut off from these offerings, implying that that is certainly a terrible fate for the soul. We also have mention that the Canaanites, like their neighbors, imagined the underworld as physically below and often associated westward sunset. The Hebrew Bible, which, though Iron Age, I will admit, preserves some of the Bronze Age heritage, it uses phrases like gathered to one's people for death, reflecting the idea of joining one's ancestors in Sheol. For instance, when biblical Jacob dies, it is said that he was gathered to his people, a peaceful phrasing. But the same texts also call the underworld a land of silence and darkness, where nobody praises God at all. And this is very much in line with the earlier Mesopotamian view. An interesting little tidbit as well. Just to go a little bit forward, in the Bible, the first book of Samuel, King Saul has a medium conjure the spirit of the prophet Samuel from Sheol. Samuel's ghost appears wearing a robe and complains of being disturbed. The story, though it is later, echoes the older Near Eastern ideas that ghosts could be summoned and that they were ordinarily at rest, residing in the shadowy earth below. So to sum things up for the Levant, Bronze Age Canaanites believed the dead lived on as shades in the underworld. Without proper rituals, one could keep them content. With powerful rites, you could even perhaps consult with them, if you knew what you were doing. The most illustrious dead, like kings, might partake in a grand assembly of ancestral spirits like the Rephaim, almost like an honored society in the afterlife. But there was no heaven or hell concept, not as rewards or punishments. Those ideas would only develop later, influenced by other religions and the Iron Age philosophical shifts. They did have a fear of even worse fate from the normal underworld, being unburied or being forgotten, and that meant restlessness and misery for the soul. Conversely, being remembered through offspring and ritual could ensure a sort of immortality of name and a seat at the feasts of the Rephaim. So now, we make the final stop on our journey through Bronze Age, and it's the Bronze Age Aegean and early Greece. And we're going to see another perspective that later evolves into what is more familiar when we think of Greek religion and spirituality, Hades and Elysium, these kinds of things. Bronze Age Aegean and early Greek beliefs, Hades and beyond. So in the late Bronze Age, we're talking 1600 to 1100 BCE. Do remember there is a little bit of overlap between the traditional collapse theories. The Greek-speaking Mycenaeans dominated the Aegean region, and they left us with spectacular tombs, like the beehive-shaped Toulos tombs and the rich grave goods, gold masks, weapons, jewelry from sites like Mycenae and Pylos. Unfortunately, there's almost no written records about their beliefs. Their linear B tablets, that is the name of their writing, mostly record inventories, which is not as fun. So to understand what Bronze Age Aegean people believed about the afterlife, we have a bit of a challenging task. We have to combine archaeological evidence with later Greek literature that likely preserves the earlier traditions, albeit a little bit more developed. Mycenaean tombs show that they, just like others, believed in equipping the dead for another life. For example, the famous Mask of Agamemnon, a gold funeral mask and other grave goods from Grave Circle A at Mycenae. They suggest an expectation that the dead chief or king might need his wealth and status symbols beyond death. They also practice funerary feasts and possibly hero cults at tombs, a practice that of course became explicit in Iron Age Greece, where communities would honor the tomb of legendary ancestors or heroes with offerings, believing of course that spirit still had power. When we turn to literature, the earliest writings are the Homeric epics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and they were roughly 8th century BCE, which likely crystallized older oral tales that go back to the Bronze Age. Homer presents a rather bleak afterlife for ordinary mortals, quite in line with the Near Eastern model. Not exactly, but it's certainly 90% there. In the Odyssey, Odysseus travels to the underworld in Book 11 and converses with dead. The realm, Hades, named after its god Hades, or in earlier Greek is actually called Aidonius, is depicted as a misty, sunless place beyond the river ocean at the edge of the world. There, the psyche, soul, of the dead flits about like a shadow. Notably, the dead lack strength or pleasure. They can only become conscious when they drink blood. Odysseus sacrifices animals so the shades can drink and temporarily regain memory and speech to talk to him. And it's there that Odysseus meets the ghost of Achilles. You know the one, from Troy, the greatest hero of the Bronze Age Trojan War. Achilles had a choice in life: die young with glory, or live long in obscurity. Guess what he chose? He chose the glory. Yet, it didn't quite work out. In Hades, Achilles utters one of the most quoted lines about the grimness of death. He tells Odysseus, "No winning words about death to me, shining Odysseus. Better to be a lowly serf ploughing for a poor man on earth than to be a king of all these lifeless dead." In other words, Achilles said that he would rather be the most impoverished laborer than the king of the underworld. This starkly communicates the Greek heroic view. Life, any life, is sweet, and death is cheerless and a miserable state. Achilles in Homer's underworld has no joy from all these honors. In fact, he laments the state of being an insubstantial shadow. It is a belief that is very much continuous with the earlier Bronze Age ideas that we have discussed. An afterlife is just a sorry reflection of life. However, Greek myth also offered some different fates. Exceptional individuals might get a different afterlife. Even in the Odyssey's underworld scene, Odysseus is told that his own father-in-law Menelaus, the husband of Helen, will not die and go to Hades like a normal man. Instead, because he is the son-in-law of Zeus, he will be sent to the Elysian plain at the ends of the earth, quote, where life is easiest for men. Here's that prophecy from the Odyssey. But for yourself, Menelaus, fostered by Zeus, it is not ordained that you should die in Argos. The immortals will convey you to the Elysian plain at the ends of the earth, where dwells fair-haired Rhadamanthus, and where life is easiest for men. There is no snow, nor storm, nor rain there, only ever-blowing breezes from Oceanus to cool mankind. For you are wed to Helen, the daughter of Zeus. It's a pretty remarkable passage, don't you think? It shows that by Homer's time, likely reflecting that Bronze or early Iron Age ideas, that the Greeks had a concept of Elysium, an otherworldly paradise reserved for a blessed few, in this case Menelaus, due to his connection to the gods. Earlier, though, Hesiod, 7th century BC, drawing on older myths, wrote that the heroes of the age before him, even after death, went to live eternally in the Isles of the Blessed, enjoying a carefree existence under the rule of Kronos. So there was an evolving notion that heroes or those favored by the gods could bypass the common lot and find a heaven-like afterward. But, unfortunately, the common man just doesn't get that good a deal. For the ordinary Mycenaean, the afterlife was probably thought of just going to Hades' realm. Some might have called it simply the below. Proper burial was extremely important. We see in the Iliad the insistence on burying the dead even during war, the truce to bury the dead, the outrage when Achilles initially withholds Hector's corpse. Those 2 points really drive it home. There's a poignant scene. The ghost of Patroclus appears to Achilles, pleading for burial so he can enter the afterlife. The scene goes like this. You sleep and have forgotten me, Achilles. Not in life were you unmindful of me, but in death. Bury me with all speed, that I may pass the gates of Hades. The spirits keep me away, nor let me join them beyond the river. I wander aimlessly through Hades' house. Patroclus' spirit literally begs for his funeral rites, because until his body is burned and buried, his soul is in limbo, unable to be admitted fully into the community of the dead. Achilles, deeply moved, of course performs the cremation and burial, after which Patroclus will finally be at his rest. The Greek belief that without a proper burial the soul finds no peace is identical to the beliefs in Mesopotamia and Canaan. It reinforces the universality of the concern for funeral rites in the Bronze Age world. Tombs from the Greek Bronze Age reflect an idea of an ancestral or familial afterlife as well. Multiple burials in a single tomb, suggesting family members would sleep with each other. Funerary art on later geometric period Greek vases shows us scenes of mourning and perhaps the deceased riding a chariot to the afterlife. In any case, the continuity between the Mycenaean practices and the later Greek tradition is very strong. Thus, the Greek afterlife belief in the Bronze Age likely was as follows: all souls go to the underworld, ruled by Hades and Persephone, a dark echo of life where existence is a faint shadow of what it used to be. Only a rare hero could hope for a special divine grace, and that idea probably grew over time, especially as mystery religions and Orphic ideals emerged in the first millennium BC, promising enlightenment and a better life after death. Just one more thing to note: the hero cult. By the end of the early Bronze Age, or the start of the Iron Age, Greeks would sometimes treat a legendary Bronze Age tomb as a holy site. For example, the tombs at Mycenae might have been continually revered. The honored dead, the heroes, were thought to possibly protect their community if they were appeased. This is like to the ancestor veneration we saw elsewhere, but focused on cultural heroes rather than personal ancestors. So, despite regional variations, certain themes are nearly universal in the Bronze Age. The dead continue to exist, in one way or another. Proper burial and rituals are crucial. The afterlife is often under the earth, and the living can impact the dead's well-being, and vice versa if you're not careful. In none of these cultures do we see a fully articulated system of heaven and hell based on moral judgment, except Egypt, which had the scenes of that idea in the Hall of Judgment, and possibly the annihilation of the wicked. Most Bronze Age people instead expected a single fate for all, with perhaps some degree in comfort, death being the great equalizer. It's fascinating also to note how these beliefs set the stage for later religious developments. For example, ideas of moral judgment and paradise or hell would later appear in Zoroastrianism. Oh, I'm going to make some videos about that soon too. And much later in Christianity and Islam. One can trace a line of evolution, certainly. It all seems to rhyme, with Egypt's feather of Mart and the concept of Elysium. Well, they were early steps. But, as requested, we've stuck to how Bronze Age people themselves describe the beliefs without later interpretation. We can't look at everything in hindsight. We just take it as it comes. So to conclude, I want you to have a little image in your head. Think of an Egyptian noble and a Mesopotamian merchant having a conversation together in the afterlife, kind of a cosmic tavern where all of these cultures can meet. The Egyptian might say, "My friend, Why do you sit here in the dark eating dust all day? Come to the field of reeds instead. The beer is sweet and the barley grows tall. The Mesopotamian ghost might shrug his shoulders and reply, "This is just how it is for us. At least my son gave me a proper burial. I have a few crumbs of bread to be thankful for that." Meanwhile, a Hittite king's spirit passes by, perhaps on his way to consult with the gods, and a Canaanite ancestral chief raises a toast from the cup of remembrance his descendants had left him. And from somewhere, the Greek Achilles mutters, "I'd rather be a plowman alive than rule among the dead." Each culture, in its own way, tried to come to terms with the great mystery of death. That, I suppose, we may never solve. They built the foundations of the afterlife on conceptions that would echo through history, and that's proved by the fact that we're talking about it 5,000 years later. So thank you, and I will wish you always to walk in that beautiful field of reeds. I will thank my top-tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Videoman, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, the HMSHH, Crystal, and Talvery. Thank you all so much, and I will see you in the next exciting video. If you've enjoyed this, like and subscribe, and perhaps consider signing up to the Patreon and checking out the merch. That would be nice too. As always, lots of love to you all. See you tomorrow.